watching this thing.
Hello and welcome everybody. It's another episode of Africa's a Country Talk, streaming as always every Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central African time. If you don't know who I am, I'm William Shoki and I'm streaming from Cape Town, South Africa.
And I'm Sean Jacobs and I'm streaming from Cape Town, South Africa. This is real, no joke.
This is real.
So
and
watch out what's going to happen right now.
Boom.
Look at that.
Look at that. Look at that. Look at that. Who's that? Who's this?
Because it's still COVID protocols, we're not gonna try and like high five
we can't touch.
We're gonna go like this. You see, this is real. This is real. Yep.
But we're in the same city. We're in the same room. Africa's a Country Talk. We started in June last year, and we've done 45 episodes. This is the 46th one, and this is not only the first time we're doing the show together. Correct. It's the first time we are meeting. Finishing club,
which is also something about Africa. It's actually this is a kind of something about Africa as a country, in which you historically this is what this website does. It's a whole bunch of people that have worked together that they've never met, often in person. I've worked with people as copy editors, as senior editors, as just people as contributing editors, editorial board, and often I've never met them. I would meet them sometimes at a conference, etc. So this is great. There was a weird. We were like, hold up. We know each other so well, kind of, but we've never met.
I was very interested to see just how tall Sean was, because the entire time the image of Sean I had formed in my mind as I could discern. I was like, okay, this guy's at least above average height for South Africans. I just wanted to. No. You definitely are above average height. I just had to discern to what extent. I was like, are you super tall? Are you tall?
I'm not super tall.
You're tall, but you're not super tall.
No, I'm not the 2 meters yet. I'm not 6 feet yet. I think my son will be taller than 6 feet. Yeah, but yeah, I'm just a regular person. I'm also from the Cape Flats. I've had some fun times this week where there are people who would ask me for something, or I'm asking for something, and they would say, actually, I went for a COVID test, and I hope the nurse, or I don't know if she was a health practitioner, is listening, because I don't want to misrepresent her. But I got into a relative tested positive for COVID, so I had to go and get a test. So first I went for a rapid. Shout out to my friend Herman Wasserman, who's been a nice host with his family. So he went with me. I got there, and when I got into and kind of registered, I sat down, I waited, I went into the room, and I don't know how it came up. She said to me, "What is your name?" And I think she may have said, "Where did you go to high school?" She said, "Oh, you say you're from Cape Town? Can you say Aware?" I was like, Aware? And then she said, "What high school did you go to?" But there was I could see that she was like, "Nah, you're not from Cape Town." I'm like, "No, I guess only Vlakte." So I just spoke a little bit of the local sort of colloquial Afrikaans. So yeah, it's been nice being back in South Africa, being home. We were joking before the program with Alex Hodge, is one of our guests today, about eating kusistas, and there was a little thing here about, we're not going to go into that today, kusistas versus koeksisters, which is two different kind of things. But I was having kusistas. I was having a proper braai, like a barbecue, a South African barbecue, and somebody wrote on Instagram, when I posted a photo of it, where are the baked beans? I was like, come on, leave me alone. But in any case, it's really great to see Will. I don't know, is there anything you want to say about the fact of meeting?
Yeah,
apart from height and other stuff.
I just wanna mention the space we're in right now.
Yes.
Being gracefully hosted by the Alternative Information Development Center, which is a think tank based in Cape Town, started in 1996 as South Africa's post-democratic transition began. And it's a think tank which is devoted to the work of thinking of political alternatives, crafting the policy visions that can realize those alternatives, and linking up with social movements and trade unions that are organizing for those alternatives on the ground. So it's been doing incredible work throughout the years. The Alternative Information Development Center, if you don't know, is the think tank that supports Amandla magazine, which you can see on your screen there. Amandla is a local South African left-wing publication, which Africa as a country has a partnership with. You can see the latest issue there, which is devoted to the labor movement, questioning whether or not it's lost its way, whether or not the trade union form still serves the way labor is organized in contemporary South Africa. And we've got a partnership with them. We republish articles from the magazine. And yeah, the AIDC is an incredible group of people, an incredible think tank, and one of those organizations that have been integral to progressive politics in South Africa for the last 25 or so years. And we're in their wonderful library, in their offices here in the Observatory in Cape Town. There's lots of great books here. They're both catching our eyes as we stream, as well as supporting our computers as we stream. So just shout out to the Alternative Information Development Center. And hopefully this is something we can do more frequently and be in this beautiful space again.
Yep. So we've got a lot to talk about today. We have we were just gonna wrap about these things, but we thought in the end it might be useful to bring in two people to join us for today for the show. And we're gonna talk about two big subjects. One is we're in South Africa, and it's been, for me especially, coming here the day I so hold on, two topics, one South Africa, and the second one we're gonna talk about the Euros. The Euros. How do you say the Euros?
The Euros, yeah.
The Euros.
European
My accent is
Championships,
becoming
if you
better
wanna
again.
be-
The European
gonna be formal.
Championship, which is from the other night, won by Italy, with England in the final. And so first we can talk about South Africa and Alex Hodge, who is part of AIDC. And what is Alex doing now these days? She's a graduate student.
We'll let her tell us.
We'll let her tell us. And then we have Peter Dwyer, who's a activist, an academic, socialist. Or let Peter maybe bring out all the nuances of what his own politics are. But he'll join us later on, and he'll talk to us about the kind of the politics of football and the European Championships, because I know Peter has his own particular relationship with the English national team. But yeah, so we'll soon bring on Alex. But just by introduction, I just wanted to mention that. So I came to South Africa basically the day that Ramaphosa announced that South Africa was going to go to level 4. That night, I was getting on a flight. So I was waiting all day to see whether or not things would change. And I was a little worried that they might say that they're shutting down the country, but instead they just went for level 4. I'm fully vaccinated. So I arrived here, and then by the first week was great, but the beginning of the second week, I moved to a friend's house. But around that time, I think my brother got infected with COVID. And so I then took a test on Friday. He took a test on Saturday. I tested negative, which is probably more proof that the vaccine is working. And he tested positive. So he started isolating. So I took both tests. First, I took the rapid, and then I took the PCR test. But the point about just mentioning the test, I also learned a little bit about how difficult and cumbersome it could be to take a test in South Africa. Because in the US now, even though the US doesn't have a public healthcare system, with COVID, they turned the whole system into a public healthcare system. And you can take a COVID test as long as you make an appointment at any public health facility. Like your local city council, health department, you can go in there and take a COVID test as many times as you want. And then they started vaccinating people, I would say roughly at the end of February, and I was fully vaccinated from the end of March. So, to sort of come here, it's been an interesting experience of sort of stepping back and sort of having to realize that there's still a lot that needed to be done around vaccinations. But yeah, people generally, I feel, are careful here, wearing masks. We made sure that before we do the program, we go through a bunch of protocols to ensure that nobody gets infected and so on. But yeah, it's been an interesting experience. But here's the part, and then we'll bring on Alex, and maybe Will wants to say something else too before we get to Alex. But the other part of the story was Jacob Zuma, the Wednesday after I arrived. So I think I arrived on the Monday, on the Wednesday, Jacob Zuma, there was this whole like standoff, like almost like a TV drama. Will he, won't he? And he finally, well, the question is whether he gave himself up or whether he was pressured, but he went to jail, essentially unlike, I would say, in the early hours of Thursday morning, and he's been in jail ever since. And then some of his supporters, they decided to protest to ask that he be released, as if the president of the country has the right to intervene in the legal process. And that's now morphed into a basically looting of private businesses in mainly two parts of the country, KwaZulu-Natal, not just in the big cities, but I understand also in a lot of the small towns, and then in some parts of Gauteng province, which is around where Johannesburg is. So essentially in parts of 2 of South Africa's 9 provinces, there's been a lot of looting. And so people are trying to understand this. Is this about Zuma? Is it something else? I think I read something earlier today that said probably the best answer is that there is no one answer. It's inconclusive. But we're curious to hear from people who watch politics here. As I said, I'm just visiting, so I'm not going to pretend to know everything. I'm just learning. I did learn that like Twitter is not the way to figure this out.
Not at all.
Not at all. Like I'm not going to learn anything from Twitter. Unfortunately, and I hope Will says something about this, and so does Alex, I think that there's an absence. The left is, I haven't seen much from kind of left-wing voices, and it might be that the left is being marginalized within South Africa's public sphere. In fact, somebody asked me right when I got here, and I phoned up a friend, and he said, can you figure out for me what is going on with the public sphere? Like who's got the loudest voice? Who's the most influential? Because he lives here, but he told me that it was very difficult for him to figure that out. In any case, this is just to set up that if you watch TV, there are these dramatic scenes of people breaking into malls. Malls are burning. Again, I'm not at this point. I'm not trying to say what my own opinions are about these things. I'm just describing it. Anyway, Will.
I mean, what you've described is correct. And from the moment Zuma was arrested, his political allies and his family took to Twitter basically to incite. So they sent out these clarion calls, calling on their supporters to shut down the country, to demand Zuma's immediate release, and to effectively make the country ungovernable. Evidence is there. It's on social media. It's not only his family and political allies, but the whole ecosystem of online profiles which support Zuma and the political project that he represents, the so-called radical economic transformation faction of the African National Congress, whose main goal effectively is to use radical rhetoric as a pretense for corruption, for creating pathways for accumulation and the ascent of the black bourgeoisie in South Africa. Their problem is that the South African economy still remains dominated by South Africa's white minority, whereas they feel like it should be dominated by the black capitalist class. So there was incitement online. There was protest that began over the weekend, which had a very clear character of being about support for Zuma. There were trucks burnt down on the N3 leading to Durban, which is the national freeway through which most freight vehicles travel. And so this over the weekend was very clearly violence that was being coordinated by Zuma supporters. But then something started to happen at the beginning of this week, and then I think this is when things get a little bit more complicated, is that the riots developed a mass character and was not only sort of a matter of trying to cause commercial disruption, but being rooted in communal outbreaks of rioting and looting. So as Sean was saying, supermarkets being raided, food being appropriated and distributed amongst people. And so there's very much an underlying condition of mass poverty, mass desperation, mass joblessness, which has caused people to participate in the looting so as to access the means of survival. Because an important thing to understand in South Africa, and this is something that publications like Amandla and Africa as a Country write about all the time, is that South Africa is an unviable society. It's got an immense concentration of wealth at the top layers, completely insufficient state support, and during the pandemic, that's been the case as well. So as Sean was saying, level 4 was announced, and despite harsher lockdown restrictions falling into place, the state announced no support whatsoever for the mass of poor in South Africa. More than, I think, half the population live below the poverty line. Unemployment rate is approaching 50%. And this has been the case from the beginning of the pandemic. And so such conditions are dire for the majority of people. They are really dire, they are really intense and tragic. And so this would be something that provides proximate cause to not only participate in looting, so as to access goods that you need to survive, but as an explosion of outrage, as an explosion of despair, as an explosion of hopelessness. And it's continued, and there's a question of to what extent is this something that is coordinated by Zuma loyalists in order to bring disruption, so as to force through political concession from the Ramaphosa administration in favor of Zuma, and to what extent is this something that is organically developing, building a mass character, and spontaneously erupting. And some instances, it looks like it's the latter, i.e., this is mass rioting that is emerging organically based off conditions of deprivation. And some instances, it looks like it's being coordinated by nefarious forces behind closed doors, just given how effective that coordination is, given, for example, footage of whole warehouses being attacked and seeing fleets of cars surrounding those warehouses, more than 20,000 people on site in order to raid these goods. And so, of course, the question really is, what is to be done? Is this something that can be redirected and channeled into a broader mobilization against austerity for the provision of public services and for the state to roll out mass support, such as through a basic income grant? Or is it something that might just get more and more reactionary? Might it devolve into intercommunal racial violence? There's been a massive reaction, for example, from small business owners, middle-class South Africans who have armed themselves and said that we're not going to let looters pass through our neighborhoods. It's been heavily racialized. Footage of some squatter camps in certain cities being burnt down by community members. And there's also the possibility that this might devolve into xenophobic violence. So there's a whole bunch of vectors that could influence this in any given direction. And it's hard to know what's happening, as the situation is extremely dynamic, and it's hard to know what is to be done. So to ask the question of what is to be done, maybe we bring on Alex so that she could tell us exactly what is up. No pressure. But we're, of course, extremely fortunate to have Alex on the show again. Alex Hotz is a recurring guest on AIAC Talk. I think she's currently a UCT master student and working at ILRIG here in Cape Town. So Alex, welcome to the show. Obviously, the situation in South Africa is extremely tense, extremely confusing.
And fluid.
What's your sense of what's going on?
So please don't expect any answers.
We're kidding. We don't expect.
No, that's fine. Yeah, that's fine.
I think I'm also trying to process, what's happening in the country as it unfolds. In the Western Cape, there's nothing happening in terms of the protests that we're seeing in KZN and in Gauteng. So that's very different, and it would be interesting to see the trajectory of the protests and whether they go and spread to other provinces. of the country, because if it is the case that people are protesting around unemployment, poverty, inequality, etc., then we have a lot to be mad about, and it's affecting the majority of people throughout the country. So I mean, this morning, as I was, going through Twitter, which I think in some ways has been, I think, useful in some instances to kind of see and hear the tone of some South Africans about what's happening. You just see, middle class South Africans at 6:30 in the morning in Cape Town running as if, nothing is happening. So that's also very telling to me. I mean, there's a lot happening within the protests, and I sent William a video earlier, which was very horrific, of small business owners who happen, I don't know if it just happens to be Indian people, but burning down townships in Pietermaritzburg. In KZN, I think it's important that, 27 years later, racial tensions amongst South Africans still is really, really high. And a lot of Black people in this country are saying, we're not only, we're exploited by people who have been oppressed under apartheid with us. And so those are obviously contested discourses. But I also think the question, there's been a lot of condemnation of looting online, on TV. I think the media is playing an incredibly difficult and divisive role, in my view, with what's happening in the country. So you can hear from the way in which some journalists and presenters are engaging with people that they're interviewing, that it's really charged. It's not, just reporting. I mean, you get a lot of condemnation around looting. I've started to maybe change the word to liberating, because one of the things that I took from, and it's been very clear to me from Ramaphosa's speech yesterday, is that instead of dealing with unemployment and inequality, listening to the demands around the basic income grant, even the 300 Rand grant, even the grant that supports women and caregivers in this country has been taken away. So instead of dealing with those things that can relieve and give some relief to South Africans, he is talking about, we must protect property. I think if you could count how many times the word property, came up, and it's clear what we're seeing, more than 45 people have been killed in the last couple of days. And you are seeing that capital, property, etc., is what is said to be needing to be protected most. And the sentiments are, if people continue in the ways in which they are, so the blame shifts, right, to people who are participating in protests, that if protests continue, then our economy is going to go into, the worst it's ever been, etc. Instead of talking about, while under the ANC and under Ramaphosa's leadership, we have seen unspeakable austerity that has meant that they've cut back on spending in terms of healthcare, spending in terms of education, spending in social services, all of those things, which I think is central to trying to kind of understand maybe the mass levels of participation in the protests. But I also don't think that it's useful to just say that Zuma isn't necessarily a factor. I think it was definitely one spark, but I think in a situation which is just getting worse and worse, I think people can see that what's happening elsewhere in the world, people are being vaccinated, there's some type of normality that people are returning to, and that's not the case in South Africa. We're going from lockdown to lockdown. People are losing income and jobs every time we go from level 5, level 4, level 3. So I think there are large things at play, but I also think there are clearly lots of unresolved political issues that are coming to the fore. I even think, questions around the national question, questions around whether to diagnose South Africa, how to diagnose what the problem is, post 1994. So I think there's lots at play, and what is very telling is there's lots of contradictions. I think middle class South Africans are showing a lot of problematic politics and tendencies in terms of how they're characterizing people who are protesting or looting.
I would say, I know you say middle class South Africans. I think often, if you, again, using South African like racial language, it's often also working classes, if you want to say, in other races. Like, it's not just middle class. There's an interesting way in which apartheid, I suppose, the legacy of apartheid has resulted, I'm going to be blunt, let's say colored people or working class that live exactly the same conditions with the same kind of deprivation as the people who eventually feel, okay, I have nothing to lose, right? Even if the police lock me up, then I can actually get a shower and a warm bed. I'm not stuck in my little small house. So I'm just saying, like, it's not necessarily just the middle class. I think there's also there's even within the same class, there are people who would condemn other people who are in the same situation as them.
And one thing to go ahead.
No, I think that's an important point. And just to also say that in Cape Town, in the Western Cape, in the height, I think it was level 5 or level 4, you had similar situations here, not to the scale that it is in KZN or Gauteng, but that was also around people being hungry. So I think there was an interesting New Frame article. But before I get there, I wanted to, I think the point that you're making about also, which speaks to racial tensions within the country, I can't imagine what some of the sentiments must be from certain, one of the conversations that have been happening is people can understand when supporting Palestine that there's a particular enemy, you are using particular means to challenge that enemy. But in South Africa, it's racialized and weaponized in a particular way, where you're seeing tremendous anti-Black racism from people who would understand the use of violence or whatever, or protest action, etc., in the context of Palestine or other kinds of
or Black Lives Matter. They can understand.
No, I mean, there's so many contradictions. Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Crazy, yeah. Some of the same middle classes who would put on their Twitter profiles about the death of a Black person in America, which we should in the United States, would literally cheer on the police, not just during this looting now, but since 94 and onwards. I mean, Tatani, remember Andries Tatani, who was murdered like live on TV, Maricana, where people talked about the minors were high or they had used muti, like making them irrational. The very same middle classes who would condemn the police violence somewhere else in the world, the racism in England against football players or whatever, cannot make that connection in their own country.
And I think what that speaks to, Alex, you were mentioning this point earlier about how when you look at the way traditional media is covering the story, it's incredibly charged. And I think that's one thing that is a mainstay of South African political life is the way in which the Black working class is pathologized, as you were saying, Sean. They're understood as possessing these essential characteristics of being violent, barbaric, savage-like, and it's part of the structure of South African capitalism, which is the bizarre thing to me is that no one in the media, no one in the public sphere ever gravitates towards the conclusion that what we're witnessing now is a completely unviable system crumbling, because what South African capitalism, which is inherently racialized, has done from its founding moment has been creating this population which is superfluous, which can be discarded, which you expel to the fringes. And the way South African life is modeled is that for most people's existence, their conscious life, there is always a population that exists all the way over there, and the only time it is ever legible to you is if they are cleaning your house, if they are, selling you something. There's, that's the way South Africa works.
And then you complain about them, the amount you have to pay them.
Exactly. So then when there's this, I think, when there's this explosion of anger and outrage, most people's reaction is that kind of shock and paranoia, because this population is something you've never engaged with, something that is completely illegible to you. And so I guess, I don't know what the point I'm trying to make is, but I think it's this, which is that I think a lot of these protests to me signify, notwithstanding, as you say, that there might be these elements that have contributed to them happening now rather than on another occasion, is a population of people that's saying we want recognition, we want to assert ourselves as being visible, as having a stake in the future of South Africa, and not as a group that is just going to quietly and passively accept our super exploitation. We've had enough.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are so many things that have been, I'm thinking about just even how quiet, or, if we're talking about, people are talking about unemployment, for example. I just saw one of the comments about how the left have been completely marginal. One would expect that, the labor movement would be able to, or would want to respond or play a role in, in the last couple of months where where, for example, unemployment amongst youth is at 74% in the country. Young people make up such a large part of the country's population at the moment. But the labor movement and the left actually have been completely marginal in their response, not only to these protests, but to what's happening in the country over the last couple of months. I mean, I think, and that's also very telling. I think some people, and it's also not, I think the question around revolution or what's going to happen in the country to challenge racial capitalism as people are experiencing it here is not going to be as neat and as pretty as people are wanting it to be. And so the question for me that I've been asking myself over the last couple of days is, what role does the left play? What is to be done in these in the protests? How do you, where are people being organized? How are people being organized? Are people being organized? What are the discussions? Those, I mean, it's hard to kind of even think about, what to do. And I think the labor movement in some instances could have an important role to play.
Can I ask a question? Because we were talking before the show, and I kind of, the reason I was sort of pausing is I wrote down to Wellington, I'm going to ask this now. So there was a quote actually that I think by Ayanda Kota, which we were going to put on the screen in a minute, and it's a quote about that those struggling for emancipatory politics can't support struggles that are organized on tribalist, male chauvinist, and ethnic basis. Everything that we are opposed to as a people that are struggling for emancipatory politics. I mean, that's very straightforward, right?
Yeah.
And in the same interview, I think he said something about that the Edward Zumas, the radical economic transformation crowd, they don't stand for the people on a principle basis. Their aim is only to dethrone the current regime so they can do the same loot. My question is really, the thing that baffles me is like, what's the thing that's going to emerge? Because as far as I'm concerned, I think the ANC project is a dead end. They can keep governing, but it's essentially electionism. So if an emancipatory or a politics that's going to emerge that could organize these working class people, right, for a political project, it cannot also fall out of thin air. It has to be like in concrete struggles. And the EFF, I think, was built on an actual, right. There was Marikana. That, I think, was what gave us the EFF. And we know the EFF project, and we've spoken to you about this before on the show, that there are people that are invested in the EFF genuinely because they think the EFF presents an emancipatory project. I think a lot of people would agree with me that that's not the case anymore. So we have to look and see where do we see. I don't think we can give up completely. So one suggestion I would make, and then I want to hear your reaction. In the United States, the argument was that Occupy happened in 2011, and that initially a lot of people there said, "Oh, Occupy it was a failure. It didn't amount to much. What it amounted to was a couple of people got some book contracts, other people got a TV show maybe or something." Similarly, I think initially with Black Lives Matter, it quickly dissolved into recrimination and arguments about it became NGOs. I think DeRay McKesson ended up running for mayor, I think, of Baltimore on a platform that was about charter schools. So the initial assessment of those movements were it wasn't going to amount to anything. But then by 2016, I would say, you saw the emergence of course, we saw it terribly in the United States, they had Donald Trump. But what they did have was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez as an electoral project. They had Bernie Sanders's brilliant run, right, in the Democratic primary, and it was only the party that stopped him. The party had to use the systems, the electoral system, if you want, of their party system to get rid of him, correct? And since then, you've seen Cori Bush, I forget her name, but there's a new mayor of Buffalo who describes herself openly as a socialist. There has been, Jamal Bowman. I could go on and on. I'm just saying, like, they've seen something there. So let me give you one example. Is there something left, the remnants of the student movement we always come back to them because I think that's the last kind of major organized political movement that had, I think, some coherent critique of some kind of post-apartheid South Africa. Maybe we shouldn't even talk about them, but is there something that we could see or feel that is, in other words, that's not out of thin air, but it is real, and can provide the impetus for something that can, because we have to, everybody says, oh, this thing is what's happening in South Africa is tragic, it's devastating, it's horrible to watch. This cannot be, the solution cannot be a solution about securitization, like security, bring in the army, bring in the police, or the other one, which is that it will eventually become a kind of a racial violence. So what is this other thing that is there something there? Even Will can answer if he wants, but you got to go first for me. Where do we see this? Is it there? And where is it?
That was a lot, so I'm gonna try and. So I think I was feeling very hopeless yesterday, and I was speaking to a dear comrade Mazibuko Jaha yesterday, and I was given a little sense of hope and possibility. And I think that sense of hope and possibility is not something that exists within a political party in this country at the moment. And I think perhaps what we should stop focusing on is electoral politics and rebuilding a left in South Africa, and a left from below, a left that we have to nothing is as it was. So this idea that we can organize ourselves in the way it was in the 80s or the 70s or the 90s, it's not. And we have to go back to, I'm talking like I was there, but there has to be a different way in which we're organizing ourselves. And I think the point that Comrade Ayanda makes around not organizing around reactionary politics, organizing an emancipatory politics that is anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-capitalist, is really fundamental. And I think there is potential for that. But I also don't think that it is as clean and as cookie cutter as we only organize with. I think that bubble for me has burst, unfortunately. I think we have to find comrades where they are at, and it is in struggle that we are going to win comrades and build, as long as, foundationally in the way in which we are organizing and building is based on emancipatory principles and politics, and around collective care. I think that's really will be fundamental. And so I was, as I saw something popped up, and so part of, what's happening at the moment, I do think one of the things the left has to do is to reject the South African Defence Force being sent to the streets of South Africa. I think it is going, and as we've seen reports today, it is going to be a disaster. We're going to see more people killed, more violence coming from the state. It has never been a machinery that has defended people. It has been a machinery that has defended the state and property. And so the other thing is, it has to be a politics that we are developing that counters remnants of and continued the shift that we see to the right of many South Africans in the minority in this country who didn't stop organizing themselves in 1994, who we're seeing arm themselves in Eshowe, in Durban, in other parts of their white suburban enclaves, which is really, really scary and dangerous.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, I think you make incredibly important points there. I think the only thing I'd like to add, and I think you've kind of suggested the what is to be done for us already, but I think related to your point that we need to think about new ways of organizing, what I think shows me a slight glimmer of hope from this recent unrest is seeing more and more South Africans, ordinary South Africans, who reflect openly and honestly on the fact that South Africa, as the current social arrangements go, simply doesn't work. I think a lot of people are slowly starting to realize, to certain and varying degrees, that you simply cannot have a country like ours that has such an extreme concentration of wealth and such an extremely widespread level of indigence. You can't have a society that has a township and right next to it the richest square mile in Africa. And I think that whichever political project that we craft in the embers of this unrest, who knows how long it'll go for, who knows what will come next, I think needs to present transformation in South Africa. Not necessarily, I think, as an explicitly left advance. We don't need to say we're struggling for socialism. That's the inevitable goal, absolutely. But I think it just needs to say what we need to do is create a society that at the very least works, that is sustainable, that supports the majority of people and provides them with healthcare, provides them with transport, provides them with education. And this should be available to everyone. It should be something that exists regardless of your class position, but is based on an idea of citizenship, where if you want to have citizenship beyond just having the rights to vote, if you want to create meaningful citizenship, then meaningful citizenship comes through social provision, comes through providing people all the means that they need to flourish individually and collectively. So obviously a discussion we'll keep talking about. Alex, thank you so much for appearing on the show today to help us make sense of everything. And we look forward to the discussion happening.
Yeah, we could go on. I mean, with you, whenever we invite you, we always feel like you should just be like a regular come on the show regularly, because we never stop talking. But thank you again, Alex. This is great. It would have been lovely to have you in the same room with us, but hopefully soon everybody here is going to be vaccinated and we can do that. So our next guest is an old friend. He's never been on the show, but he's a longtime friend of mine, actually. I think probably older than Will is. Peter Dwyer, who is a teaching fellow at the University of Warwick. And the other part of Peter's life is that he's also a big football fan. But we're going to start by asking him about his impressions about what's going on in South Africa. And by way of introduction, I just want to add, I actually met Peter when he first came to South Africa in the late 90s, when he was researching the sort of a biographical study of trade unionists, like what had happened to the trade unionists of the anti-apartheid era, when South Africa transitioned into a liberal democracy. And I know Peter then ended up working in South Africa for a long while at the Center for Civil Society at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. So he's not, he's been following South Africa, particularly in that province. So he knows about the housing struggles, the struggles around poverty. So maybe, Peter, I don't know, you watching this from Britain, you watching this, play out. What are your impressions about what's going on here, what this crisis is about, and, how we can get out of this?
That's an easy question, isn't it? How'd you get out of it? It was 1997. 1997 we met, Sean. Mm-hmm. I think I even had hair back then.
You did.
I did, yeah. Look, I mean, I think you covered a lot of it there, what yourselves and Alex said. I mean, obviously some of it is Zuma's supporters, but I think they're kind of marginalized and not as big as I think he thought he was. So I think that side of it may sort of pit it out. But I think what really the protests are is really pent up anger and frustration since, going back, nearly 30 years now, with the failure of what was called the transition and all the problems that still, dog South Africa, the structural unemployment that's 50-60%. It's even worse now than it was in the sort of early noughties. I mean, people are hungry, people are tired, people are bitter, people are frustrated. I think that's what it reflects. And I think as Alex said, it's not about looting, it's about liberating. People want to, people need to feed their kids, feed their families. They still see, predominantly white people owning and controlling all the wealth. Predominantly white people live in all the rich areas. Of course, they've been joined by a rich black elite. The ANC didn't take over Santon and take the wealth from the white people. The ANC leadership and their supporters went and moved to Santon. That's one of the greatest ironies. And that's another reflection of people's anger as well. So I'm not surprised by it at all. And I think you have to take a long view of it and put it in the context of what hasn't happened in South Africa since the ANC got to power. And of course, the Zuma corruption scandal is a touchstone for all of that. But corruption, I don't think corruption is the issue. It's poverty and mass unemployment and lack of delivery is the issue in South Africa. Corruption is a component part of that, if you like. It's a spin-off from it. And the fact that the ANC are sadly not held accountable either by the electorate. And in one way, this is the way black people hold them to account, is that, they're going to take things. If the rich black elite are seen to take things along with the whites, then poorer people are going to take things when they get the chance. It's the same everywhere. There were riots in Britain in 2011, not long after austerity, in predominantly working class areas. It was multiracial, and people called it a form of liberation. The people who were taken from the shop said, we're taking what belongs to us, because they see other rich people with it, who don't work as hard as others, who don't suffer employment and recession. So, that's how I see it, really. Can you ask me an easier question now?
Let's ask you an easier question, because what's crazy about this past week is that all of this unrest in South Africa exploded during another major international event, and we're happy to talk to you about that. You're wearing a t-shirt that says Forza. I wonder if that's a reference to that major international event. The Euros happened. The final was on Sunday, and Italia, they won. And of course, I think a lot of people were thinking to themselves, well, there's a lot of awful happening in the world right now, and that awful would just be more awful if it went to England and it went home and we wouldn't hear the end of it for the next 100 years. So
for the next week, maybe even whatever.
But I mean, is your t-shirt an ode to the Italians given their recent victory, or will you stand up and does it say something else? What is the t-shirt? There you go.
No, it's a play to the international of Liverpool and many European Cup exploits and victories. But it's also, it's my way of a little ode to the victory of the Italians, which I really celebrated in many ways. I mean, part of me, in some respects, wanted the English football team because of what they've done. Their anti-racism, their fighting against poverty, their support for the National Health Service. They've been an inspiring team in many respects, in a way that no other English team ever has. And they're a very diverse, multicultural team. Over half of the squad have parents or grandparents who are from the African or Caribbean or Irish diaspora, or from those countries themselves. So, it's a very multicultural, diverse team. So in that sense, I wanted those lads to win. But of course, I can never support England as both an internationalist, a socialist, and a Liverpool fan, and someone from Liverpool, because there's a long history of resentment to the British and English state as well. Look, it's not everyone in Liverpool or all Liverpool supporters, but it certainly is like that for me and for others as well.
I think this was an interesting Euros. I mean, what you just described now about how this team was multicultural, it's diverse, it's got these awesome individuals like Marcus Rashford, who put pressure on Boris Johnson to reopen the school breakfast program. This Euros was interesting because it was a football tournament that felt extremely political. So I remember Gideon Rahman wrote an article as the tournament started for the Financial Times, when he was just describing his efforts to try and attend a match, and the fact that the players knelt, there were loud boos. I think it was England v Scotland. There was tense political air in the stadium, given the rise of Scottish nationalism in the wake of Brexit. So there's all of these political influences and overtones dominating the tournaments. Do you think that's, I mean, how political do you think this Euros was? Is that an overstatement? Or do you think it really was a tournament that had an expressly political character?
Oh, no, you're absolutely right, William. In fact, it could even be an understatement. I mean, this is undoubtedly one of the most political football event of modern times for all sorts of reasons. But primarily, the reason why this Euros was so political was down to Black Lives Matter. It's as simple as that. If there was no Black Lives Matter, there'd be no taking the knee. If there was no Black Lives Matter, there'd be no debate about anti-racism, all around the world, but particularly in the US and the UK. And if there was no Black Lives Matter, then, there wouldn't be this whole post-fallout of the racist abuse of some of the England players. And it's forced a right-wing, I'd say, racist government on the defensive, in which, even some of the papers that support the government have highlighted the hypocrisy of Boris Johnson and the Home Secretary, who's responsible for law and order, Priti Patel, herself, ironically, the daughter of Asian immigrants from Africa. The hypocrisy of them has been condemned by the press. The Financial Times editorial today, The Sun has hinted at it, the most right-wing racist paper in the UK. The Daily Mail also. All these right-wing xenophobic anti-immigrant newspapers have pointed out, that it's hypocritical for Boris Johnson and Priti Patel to condemn the England players for taking the knee, and now suddenly they're condemning the racist abuse. And this has led to an absolute incredible outpouring on social media and in the mainstream press and TV about racism, anti-racism, and things like that. I mean, the best example really was from Tyrone Mings, the sort of mixed England player who put out an incredible tweet attacking Priti Patel. And what he said was that, Priti Patel condemned the racism of the attacks on the English players on social media, for missing the penalties as well. And then he turned around and said that, how can you sort of talk about this when especially you've been, lighting the sort of spark to racism by condemning the taking of the knee. And the reason, they take the knee, as the English players have pointed out, is because of racist abuse. If you then condemn that taking of the knee, how dare you, then be shocked and feign fake disgust at this racist abuse happening. And that's been incredible. I mean, when has an England player, never mind the footballer, attacked the government ministers, and the Prime Minister for being hypocrites about anti-racism? I mean, it's absolutely fantastic. I mean, there's been a massive politicization of anti-racism, and it's really opened up an incredible debate. And, this has been led in part by the English players and, the English team and everything they stand for. And it's incredible that it's directed not just against the sort of racist minority, and it is a minority, who've abused the English players, excuse me, it's been directed at the government and right-wing politicians. I mean, that's fantastic. I mean, it's absolutely brilliant. But again, if it wasn't for Black Lives Matter and the huge protests, this wouldn't be taking place. So absolutely, William, it's one of the most political sporting events in a very long time. And this debate will run and run.
I mean, the one thing that struck me was, so England lost the tournament, the final, but in the process, the politics that the team stood for or is standing for won or is winning. I mean, it hasn't won yet, but what I'm saying, what you just described is kind of suddenly Rashford released a statement, I think, where he talked about, I'm not apologizing for who I am, that I'm a black man in Britain, and I'm from a particular place. You have Tyrone Mings going after Priti Patel, and now this, as you said, that what they represent is now almost not controversial anymore, because and I would like for you to say something about that. For example, in the lead up to the tournament, there were black players were in the same squad. Like, for example, I mean, I would love for you to talk about this, like Raheem Sterling and the kind of abuse that he received, right? And he was the player that got them to the final. So it's fascinating, like how he gets him to the final. He wasn't that great in the final. 3 black players are the ones who kind of missed the crucial penalties. And normally, and this was, I remember on Twitter, people were saying, okay, now we're going to get all this abuse from the English fans, which did happen. There was the kind of tepid response by the English FA. And I think people thought, you know, it's going to be, again, this is what it's going to be like. But it seems that there's something else happened. We're now in this kind of moment where it looks like Black Lives Matter is now a normal, it's normal politics now.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the really incredible thing. I mean, this had been building and building. I mean, just before England got through to the sort of the group stages, a really interesting debate was starting to emerge about, you know, what this team represents and how they might represent the different England or the real England. This was epitomised in an article by the former Liverpool player Jamie Carragher. Ironically, he writes in the Daily Telegraph, which is you couldn't find a more pro-Conservative Party newspaper in Britain. In fact, we call it the Daily Tory Graph, Tory being the old nickname for the Conservative Party. But in that paper that was then, if you like, summarised by other mass-selling papers like the Daily Mirror, Carragher made some really, really interesting points. He talked about how, you know, this team have taken on issues which, you know, previous players and other England squads never had. You know, Sterling had took on the racists, as Sean mentioned. Rashford had talked about and made the government to turn a U-turn on free school meals for kids like him. Jordan Henderson, the Liverpool captain, had campaigned on behalf of the NHS and got players to donate money, and many of the England players were donating their earnings from the Euros to the NHS as well. And what Carragher said was really interesting. He said that Southgate and his players have kind of come up with or constructed a new idea of what it might be to be the England team or what Englishness is. And what Carragher pointed out to was he then criticised the politicians, Boris Johnson and Priti Patel and the like, who criticised the players for bringing social issues and anti-racism to the fore, if you like. And he said now they're jumping on the bandwagon and trying to support them. And he attacked them for that and said they're hypocrites. So there was an attack on the politicians for being hypocrites prior to the final. There's now further attacks on them for them trying to show their anti-racist credentials when clearly they're not. And I think that's kind of unprecedented for sports players of such prominence. I mean, you know, Rashford and Sterling have got millions of followers on Facebook. I bet they've got more than the whole of the Conservative government put together. You know, so they're putting this stuff out there and, you know, they're really embedding themselves in popular culture and putting across an anti-racist message. And that's just absolutely fantastic. And it's brilliant for anti-racism and the anti-racist movement. You know, what we've got to do now is turn that into more campaigning and more activism. And in fact, we've got to turn it into further action. Now, just to give you another sense of how deep this is going, Sky Sports News, which is in part owned by Robert Murdoch and dominates, obviously, football in the UK, you know, on their main programmes last night, they were criticising the FA and the government for just putting out statements and saying they need to turn these statements into action. Now, the fact that Sky Sports News are saying that, again, is down to Black Lives Matters. You know, the fact that this whole debate is taking place at the level it is in such a wide forum of social media, the mainstream media, TV, and the print media, is all down to Black Lives Matters. And I think it's really, really important we don't lose that focus because, you know, that's really the turning point was those protests last year. There's always been anti-racist movements. There's been, you know, some speaking out by Sterling and others. But the fact that the whole of the media are talking about it, and I've got the front page of the Sun here, you know, the most racist, one of the most disgusting newspapers.
Hold on. You actually bought the paper. You bought the Sun.
I only got a copy of it today just for this program to show you, because look, it's incredible.
I know you don't. I know you don't buy the Sun. I know you don't buy the Sun.
Of course I don't buy the Sun. But look at this.
Yeah, that's you. I would never expect to see that.
Wow.
Nobody did. And that's really incredible. The fact that the Sun are now having to put 3 black players saying we defend you against racism on the front page is incredible. And that's a victory to Black Lives Matter and the anti-racist movement. Of course, many of us don't trust them and they're a false friend. This is a paper that's been constantly xenophobic, racist, anti-immigrant as well. So, you know, we won't be relying on them.
By the way, you should also add, and shameless when it came to Hillsborough. The Hillsborough tragedy. Course, yeah. So this is not a paper with good moral. Well, if you want with ethics, it's not a paper with ethics.
And sorry, while we're on Hillsborough, because this kind of takes me to the question I wanted to ask, where as far as race in sport is concerned, it seems like we're turning a corner insofar as it's now, as you say, mainstream in order to call out racism, in order to call out the transformation of the game, the diversification of the faces representing the highest orders and codes and so on. But it's almost kind of thinking about this in relation to, for example, the nature of the game itself, football as a sport, and how that is still dominated by moneyed interests, how the trend it's walking on seems to still be the commercialization in favor of football capital and whatever. I mean, this is happening the same year of the Super League proposal, which thank goodness fell apart, but that only gives us temporary respite. And we still think that football is going to continue to head on in this other direction. So when it comes to football itself, at the end of a tournament like the Euros, I guess one thing that was, I think for me, another reinvigorating thing about the Euros is that people seem to believe in national sports again, whereas I think during the pandemic, a lot of people during the Nations League were starting to question it, say, no, the future of football is club football exclusively. But it seems like the Euros kind of vindicated the virtues of national sports. So I just want to get your thoughts on the state of the game right now. What are the trends? Where does it look like it's going?
Yeah, I mean, look, football has been changing for many years in the UK, and the sort of over commercialization of it and the television rights with Sky and others has brought lots of money into the game that has transformed it. It's transformed stadiums; they're better. Certainly at the higher end level, you know, the grounds have been transformed. But of course, that was in part a response to the Hillsborough disaster and the legislation that said that, you know, everybody must have seating now in the bigger stadiums. But it is changing. I don't think it's changed for the better in some ways. You know, the hype and the commercialization. Ticket prices in the Premier League have gone through the roof, you know, way above inflation. I mean, you know, there's been some great comparisons done about, you know, the equivalent prices of things like, you know, a shirt today that costs, you know, so much less now than in comparison to a Premier League ticket than what they cost comparatively at the start of the Premier League in the 90s. So that's a terrible part that's pricing a lot of people out of the game. But it has to be said, you know, stadiums are so much better. You know, the seating's better, they're safer, you know, the toilets, the facilities. I mean, they are just incomparable to when I was starting going to game in the late 70s and how we were treated in the 1980s. So, you know, there's two sides to that. I don't think it's, you know, it's either one or the other. It's rubbish or, you know, it's all brilliant. It's very mixed, as everything always is. I think, you know, this England team and what they've done politically and socially may be a turning point. It's too early to say, and we all get carried away hoping for the next great turning point, don't we, in politics and analysis and things like that. It's still too early to say, but it's definitely captured the public's imagination. I think the viewing figures were the biggest TV viewing figures since the death of the funeral of Princess Diana. So it really galvanized England, and I suspect Wales and Scotland as well, although obviously many people there may not have wanted England to win. But, you know, I've never seen so many black and Asian faces at England football matches ever when I constantly scan the crowd carefully in the TV. I think that was really telling as well. I've also never seen LGBT banners at England games and many other football games for that matter. You know, the fact that Harry Keane wore an LGBT armband, and of course he's the son of Irish immigrants, is absolutely fantastic. So, you know, that's all changing a lot. let's see how it happens, and how it materializes afterwards. There's still a minority of racists, bigots, homophobes, sexists in all clubs, including the big ones, including Liverpool. You can't romanticize any team or club, but it's definitely better, safer, and more friendlier, but it still goes on. But I still think it is a hardcore minority, and those people after this competition, I think, will feel less welcome at every football ground in the country, and that undoubtedly is a better thing. Does it mean it will stop? No. Does it mean we have to stop in our campaigning? No. We have to push even harder now, because we should take confidence from the Euros and the debate that's emerged out of it.
Yes. Here's the last question then for you. I've never heard you speak about the English football team like this, because I know you were, me, I don't support the English football team anyway. I don't actually support any European football team. We actually had a thing called the Africa as a Country odds, where we would say we watch a game and we would decide to support that team based on the history related to colonialism. These are all non-footballing reasons, or how many players they have of African descent. England actually did well on the representation side. Every week, every game, you'd have to sort of do this. But my question to you is, knowing all of this, and I know you did not want England to win, so I'm not going to give away our secrets, but you sound like you could be, and I remember you could be changed. Could you change your mind on England, on the football team, given what the team looks like, increasingly look like? And I'm asking you this because I remember when, I think it was 2006 maybe, or 2010, Gary Young famously wrote a piece in The Guardian where he wrote about how he looked at his nephews and nieces and they had bought England jerseys. And he was like, wow, I never supported England. I'm not going to support England. But these kids have a totally different relationship with this team. I mean, would you just, the whole sort of this, I know you say it's a tension, it's not resolved, but could you support England?
I find it personally very difficult to support England. I can support what those lads done because they done amazing things off the pitch and on the pitch. As a football team, I thought Italy would win. Actually, I just thought they were a better team anyway. But no, personally, being a Liverpool fan, the history of tension between Liverpool and Britain and the English. Britain, the British state, if you like, politically, the way Thatcher and them used that managed decline of Liverpool purposely, politically, it's a problem for me. And as an internationalist and a socialist, I'm not patriotic to any country. I am an internationalist. But no, look, you've got to acknowledge and understand that the debate around what it is to be English and Englishness is changing. I don't think what they've achieved, I don't think, their multiculturalism, their diversity, their anti-racism, I don't think that changes my ultimate argument about the danger of, patriotism and nationalism, be it English or South African for that matter. But I think it changes the argument and how we approach it. To simply just write off England fans as all this, all that, and supporting England is just a waste of time or means you're reactionary. That is foolish. It's not as simple as that. It never has been, but it's a lot more, a lot less simple than that now and more complex. And if the left don't in England and Britain don't understand that, then they'll find it even harder to connect and build the anti-racist movement. So the England team and what they've done, who they are, on and off the pitch, but for me, predominantly off the pitch, have opened up the debate about anti-racism in a way that no other probably football team ever has. But again, my final point, this is all down to Black Lives Matter and huge protests in Britain and the US and elsewhere. And that's what we have to be thankful for.
No, I think you're right. I was just thinking while you were talking, the French team used to be given this kind of attention and they were sort of written about in the same way. And people also learned after a while that football wasn't enough. Like, you couldn't leave it to that because, France, the struggle against racism, the struggle for public services, etc., and the sort of the non-politics of Macron, and you end up in France with now somebody who's ostensibly a neoliberal, because that politics it has its own logic. So yeah, it's more than that. Yeah, definitely.
And you mentioned. Go ahead, Peter.
No, just while you mentioned France, I think, you know, there's an important point there. Yes, it was brilliant the way the world's media and the French media lauded the multiculturalism of that brilliant World Cup team. But actually, since then, the far right and racism has got worse in France. So it's never as simple as what players do on the pitch or the fact that we've got a diverse football team. You can't read things off so mechanically. You know, there's a danger that a real far right racist president might get elected in France now. So how do you figure that out, considering that way back, what was it, 96, they had one of the most multicultural, diverse national teams. So, you know, it doesn't mean suddenly everyone in France is anti-racist. You have to constantly work at it and build it and use those opportunities when they open up.
Exactly. And in South Africa, we can say the same about the Springboks. I mean, we're speaking of social tensions. I remember in 2019, social tensions were at pitch. We won the World Cup. Suddenly they disappeared for a bit. Now they're back again. So sports is never enough. And thanks for those closing thoughts, Peter. And thank you for coming onto the show.
Brilliant. And thanks for having us.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, great.
And I think that brings us to the end of today's program. We went through that one trying to discuss quite a lot. Obviously, a lot of the discussion we had remains unresolved, but a real pleasure being able to do it in the same room as Sean.
We lost that camera, but we have a tweet that we could put up to show you that we're not lying. We are in the same room. We're on the same.
There you go.
We are in the same room.
I could turn my computer right now and show you that Sean is in the same room as me. So we're not messing
lying
with you guys. This is not fake news.
This is not fake news.
We're not spreading misinformation like a lot of South Africans are at the moment. We're truthful South Africans. And I think this is going to be the last
program of the season.
Yeah, wow. We're going to be gone for a minute.
We're going on a break for the summer.
So we just
for the winter, yeah. It's very cold here, by the way. Hey, I'm not used to this anymore.
We just don't have good indoor heating. That's the problem.
I think the houses weren't constructed knowing that there's winter here.
Yeah, not knowing that there's winter, knowing that, you know, climate change happens and
it's so cold. It's so cold. Sometimes you take a shower and when the water hits your skin, it's like a shock on your skin. You know,
well, that's
your skin is like, yo, what is this? What is this? It's really crazy. It's really crazy.
So to you, our supporters, our fans, thank you so much for bearing with us all through all these episodes, 46 now. And thank you to tuning in every week. Thank you to Antoinette Engel, who produces every week.
All the shows. We got it,
every
proper. I don't know
show.
if she wants to come on camera. It's up to her. I think she is. Yes.
Yes.
Finally, she's here. She's a real person.
Wonderful. Well done to us.
Well done.
From like those. Remember those shows we did, which were like they didn't really. They were like no advertise. We didn't advertise them.
Yeah.
We were just
our
testing
internet was
out,
so
see
bad.
how this would work
we
out.
were like always moving like that.
I would go up to rural towns and the internet wouldn't work. It was. I can't even. Yeah, it was crazy.
We've come a long way. We've really come a long way. Yeah, you guys make it easy, so thank you. It's been a pleasure.
No, you make it
such a pleasure.
You make it easy.
So yeah. Thank you so much,
Great
Anthony.
show.
Great show. Thanks to Alex Hotz. Thanks to Peter Dwyer.
Excellent. Yeah, Peter. By the way, I want to give Peter props on air. I hope he's still listening. When actually I attended along with Peter and some other people, including my dad and my son, the last football game that was played in Europe with a crowd,
full capacity,
with a full capacity crowd. It was Liverpool at home in the second leg of their round of 16 game, I think it was, against Atletico Madrid. And after that, football was shut down. But Peter was one of the most generous hosts. I always tell him this. He's like, we are like brothers, but we're from different places. He was a great host. He took care of my dad, like just showing us around and being great. So I'm doing this here, Peter, to properly thank you for always being like a real brother. So in any case, great program for me. Enjoy, everybody. And this is the last show of the season.
Last show of the season.
No more Tuesdays for
a while. From Cape Town, South Africa, in the same room, the wonderful officers of the Alternative Information Development Center. Thanks to Alex Hotz. Thanks to Peter Dwyer. Thanks as always to Antoinette Engel. And thank you, Sean.